I am a clinical social worker and co-author of our new Making Peace with Food card deck, and I'm excited to be here today.
And I'm Christy Harrison. I'm a registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, author of Anti-Diet, and co-author of the Making Peace with Food card deck with Judith. So very happy to be here today as well.
So we're ready to answer your questions. I know a couple were submitted ahead of time, so we're going to take a look as soon as the first one pops up. So I guess I want to say that I've been doing this work for a good 20, 30 years now. And when I first started, the term we used was non-diet. We were trying to move away from the dangers, the harms of dieting, and look at what it means to let go of dieting and learn to become an attuned or intuitive eater. And I'm going to turn this over to Christy because that's the name of her book. And I think you may have been one of the first people to use the term anti-diet.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I had probably heard it before somewhere, but I have really embraced it and sort of started calling myself an anti-diet dietitian and called my book Anti-Diet because to me, it's about, taking a stand against diet culture. And especially, I think, with the term dietitian, right? The word diet is in the name. And so wanting to sort of be able to distance myself from that by saying like, well, I might be a dietitian, but I'm different than what you might expect from a dietitian. I'm not going to put you on a diet. I'm not going to engage in diet culture. And really by diet culture, what I mean is, weight stigma, right? Stigmatizing larger bodies and lionizing smaller ones, demonizing certain foods while elevating others, promoting weight loss as a means of attaining higher status, and oppressing people who don't match that supposed picture of health. So those are the sort of four tenets of diet culture as I define it. And to me, anti-diet is just a nice way to kind of say like we stand against those things, right?
Very clear. It's a very
yeah. The term non-diet, I think, is also great. I mean, there's lots of people that I, would sort of consider in the anti-diet camp that will self-identify as non-diet. I think it's just a matter of preference. The word anti, maybe to some people feels a little strident, but to me, I think, that sort of stridency can be
stronger.
Yeah. And to me, that feels like, it gets the conversation, it sparks the conversation, right? So I think that's sort of why I embrace that term.
So I want to address the second part of that question. How would I explain it to someone else? In diet culture, the expectation is that it's good to lose weight and you should always be trying. And if it didn't work last time, but here's a new one, this one sounds more scientific. I know somebody else who did it and it worked for them, you should do it. And being anti-diet means really recognizing that the diet in and of itself is the problem, that the restrictions that come along with dieting set people up to either rebound eat, if I say starting tomorrow, you can never have ice cream again, what are you going to do tonight? You're going to want ice cream all the more. And so it's telling people that you've been there, done that you've tried dieting and you've come to understand that the restrictions of dieting, the deprivation of dieting, actually lead to more eating to discomfort, and that you're making a commitment to stop those kind of restrictions, even if it takes time and patience and a lot of compassion to do that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I agree with all of that.
Okay. All right. So next question, please. This is fun.
Oh. Judith, do you want to kick this one off?
I'll go ahead with that. I just mentioned the word compassion, and I really want to emphasize that, for most people that I work with, they've been dieting for years or even decades. And so it's a process of unlearning. People already have foods so categorized as good or bad, I shouldn't, or counting points or whatever it might be. And it takes time to undo that. So my first one is just patience with the process. What we talk about in the card deck, we have cards around how to get started, like things like beginning to tune into your hunger, things like giving yourself permission to eat all types of food and letting go of judgment so you can really slow down, reconnect with your body and figure out in this moment, what will truly satiate me? What will feel good? And knowing that you can have it again, that it's not going to go away, that starting January 1st, you're not going to, start restricting or clean eating or whatever you want to call it, makes it safer to stop. If it's not going away, it's safe to stop. And something else I want to add along these lines is make sure you don't change this into a new diet, which I call the stomach hunger diet, where the rules are now, I have to eat when I'm hungry and I have to stop when I'm full. That is not what the journey to make peace with food looks like, because again, you're unlearning so much. So be patient with yourself and the process, but hold on to that commitment that if a diet was going to work for you, it would have worked. But it actually increases the probability of feeling out of control with food.
Yeah. And to that point too, I would say, rejecting the diet mentality, right? The diet mindset, really getting away from that as sort of the first foundational piece of making peace with food. If you're just starting your journey of healing your relationship with food, I think one of the first elements that I've found with people it's really helpful is just to start tuning into what those rules, what those beliefs, what those diet mindset, sayings or values are actually telling you, right? What's going through your head that's coming from the diet mentality, and how can you start to challenge those beliefs, or even just start to notice them, right? Start to notice, isn't this interesting? I'm hungry for this much, but I'm serving myself less. Why is that? Or I'm really interested in having this food, but I'm telling myself I need to have this other thing instead. Where does that come from? Starting to sort of interrogate those diet culture values that you might have internalized and sort of are now living and practicing without even realizing it. I think can be another helpful first step, and sort of help not turn this intuitive or attuned eating journey into another diet.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, we're ready for the next one.
These are great questions.
You want to take that, Christy?
Sure. Yeah. So, what are some diversity considerations in doing this work? First of all, I have to acknowledge that, I'm a person with a lot of privileges, right? White, relatively thin, cisgender, relatively able-bodied, although have multiple chronic illnesses and PTSD. So my lived experience, while I do have an eating disorder history, is not going to be the same as someone who's more marginalized and has lived through, experiences that I haven't. And so having that sort of humility, having that sort of understanding that everybody's experience is going to be different and conditioned by their backgrounds, their identities, and that typically in this process of healing from disordered eating and making peace with food, sort of the more areas of marginalization a person has in society, right? The more racism they have to face, or sexism, or homophobia, or transphobia, probably the more challenges they will have to face in making peace with food as well. One example of this is that, fat phobia is really a form of anti-Blackness, or that's sort of the history under which it was construed, right, and constructed. So Sabrina Strings, a sociologist, has a really great book called Fearing the Black Body that I think is great to check out if you're interested in sort of diving deep into those historical roots. And I covered that a little bit and quoted from her in my book, Antidiet, in the history chapter, and sort of laid out this history of, how diet culture has racist roots, how it has roots in misogyny and, just sort of xenophobia in general. And that if you're someone who has, values diversity, values inclusion and equity, and is maybe a person who is more marginalized in society, sort of knowing those roots and knowing that history, I think can be really helpful in helping you build some, bulwark, or build a fire to kind of stand against diet culture and try to heal your relationship with food, while also knowing and understanding and having compassion for yourself that this process might be harder because you are going to face additional barriers, perhaps in accessing care, in being able to heal your relationship with food and not have doctors, say, commenting on your weight the whole time and sort of triggering you again into those disordered behaviors. So those are a few things that I think are helpful to consider in doing this work.
I appreciate your answer. I want to just add something just slightly different, which has to do with where people live and accessibility to food. So sometimes when we talk about intuitive eating, we're saying, get exactly what you're hungry for. Well, it's easier said than done for many people. So if you're living somewhere or you're working with clients who live in food deserts where what they might want isn't available or they can't afford it, we need to be really aware of that too. And I think, to me, at the core of intuitive eating is letting go of that diet mindset, no matter what a person's circumstances. But also we have to be really flexible with how intuitive eating gets used. Like like you acknowledged, I also have a lot of privilege, and so I've had to really make sure I'm aware that the way I might talk about intuitive eating isn't accessible for everybody.
Yeah, and I think extending on that too, like one thing I've had conversations with clients and people who are more economically, in a lower socioeconomic status, and maybe can't afford the foods they want all the time, or are concerned about food security and things like that. It's like, it's not necessarily, intuitive eating is not about checking all the boxes or doing all the principles, quote unquote, perfectly, or eating exactly what you want when you want it, because if we really sort of took that to its logical conclusion, I think that would be inaccessible for almost everyone, right? Like it's, if you're craving caviar, like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to have caviar, right? But, if you're craving something that is out of reach for you and you are, using like food benefits, right? EBT in the US or whatever, sort of just, I think, destigmatizing the types of foods that you might be able to have access to, and also the food, if you're having a craving for a particular food that is demonized in diet culture, right? But that's the food that you have access to, that's the food that you really want and crave and have the resources to afford. Challenging those beliefs that would stigmatize you for that, right? And saying, I'm doing the best I can with what I have, and that's intuitive eating too, right? That's doing your best to get your needs met, and whatever your circumstances, doing your best to get enough food and to meet your needs, and honor your hunger to the best of your ability, I think is the work.
All right, next question. Okay, what's our take on emotional eating? Well, I want to start by saying eating is an emotional experience. So we are all emotional. We all engage in emotional eating. And I don't know, I guess emotional eating gets a bad rap as something that's bad. You shouldn't do it. And so I guess I want to tell you how I think about it as a therapist. Um, all of us sometimes turn to food for we're bored, we're stressed, and that's normal. What happens for some people, though, is that it becomes their primary way of managing emotional distress. And that's often when somebody's coming to me as a therapist to work on it. But the thing about it is, and it might surprise you, that even as a therapist, that is never where I start, because what I know is that diet culture is almost always part of this. And what I mean by that is that somebody who says to me, I eat emotionally, meaning, and with the meaning that they rely on it to deal with all kinds of feelings, to the point that they're feeling out of control with food or often eating to discomfort. Before I want to work on emotional issues, I want them to understand how the deprivation of dieting, because I can assure you just about everybody who's struggling with that, with emotional eating, also is engaged in diet culture in some way, and they have their list of foods that are good and bad. So what I mean is that if somebody comes home from work and they start eating, some bags of potato chips, and they say it's because I was upset at work, how do they know it's because they were upset at work, or if chips have been restricted, that they broke through the restrictions? So we know that restrictive eating is one of the biggest causes of people eating to discomfort, eating in ways that feel out of control. So I always start there with people around letting go of a diet mindset, like we talked about earlier, and just beginning to notice hunger, just beginning to try to start to identify what they're hungry for, what types of food, choosing from a wide variety, working on their fear foods, the foods they say, I can't have chips in the house, beginning to help them. And we go through some steps to do that in the card deck, being able to help them begin to eat chips in a way that feels more comfortable to them, more satisfying to them. Once I've helped people start to build that internal structure of knowing when they're, eating when they're hungry, stopping when they're satiated, much of the time, then we're in a much stronger position to look at the emotional eating. Partly we're in a stronger position because they're feeling calmer. When you're anxious about food all the time, it's hard to slow down and deal with uncomfortable feelings as well. But once the restrictions are lessened and we see less of that deprivation driven eating, or what we've been calling rebound eating, then people are able to start to look at, I'm reaching for food and I'm not hungry. What's going on right now? What would I think about or feel if I didn't eat this right now? Because eventually it's helpful for people to have other skills, other ways to deal with those feelings. To, first of all, to name them, because sometimes people are reaching for food before they even have a chance to figure out what's really going on with them. So to name, I'm feeling sad today, I'm feeling angry, and then start to think about, when I feel this way, how else can I get through these times of emotional distress? How can I build my window of tolerance? What are my needs really in that moment? And what are other ways I can begin to meet my needs? So it's really important for people to address that emotional eating if they're relying on it in the way I'm describing. But we should never assume from the start that that's what's going on, or think that, as a therapist, what I'm aware of in our field, the idea has been, if people can just understand why they're eating, it will go away. And it's just not true. You have to intervene directly with the diet cycle, the restriction, and then, rebound eating cycle, before you can really effectively work on emotional eating.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that is, something I've seen is people wanting to do something instead of eating, right? Oh, if I could just call a friend instead of picking up these chips or whatever, if I could just take a bath instead of eating, which I think comes from the sort of some popular sort of self-help books about emotional eating and stuff, this idea of like substitution. And the sort of implication of that is like, if I'm able to do that, then I'll eat less and lose weight, right? And sometimes that's explicitly stated in these popular self-help resources, and sometimes it's not explicit, but it's sort of more implied. But I think that goes back to the diet mindset, right? That's very much turning this into, the don't ever eat when you're having a feeling diet, instead of, let's figure out what you're actually feeling and how to meet your needs in addition to food, right? So not doing something instead of eating, but yes, of course, you're allowed to eat. You have unconditional permission to eat. There's nothing, there's no diet rule stopping you from doing that. And also, is there a way to, soothe or nurture or meet your needs in other ways that are in addition to food?
I'm sorry. Right.
I was just going to say on a different point, one other thing I'll add about emotional eating that I find interesting from like a dietitian's perspective is that a lot of times people have these subtle signs of hunger that are more mental in nature, right? They're thinking about food, or they're starting to feel irritable and hangry, or they're, having like low mood or difficulty concentrating or things like that. Those can actually be signs of needing to eat. And sometimes I think in diet culture, it gets framed as, oh, I'm angry, so I'm eating my feelings, or I'm distracted and bored, so I'm like eating to soothe that boredom or whatever. And actually, sometimes the deprivation, the sort of subtle levels of hunger, which I think we don't really learn to recognize, or we sort of forget how to recognize in diet culture, because diets condition us to wait until we're ravenous to eat, right? And wait until like the stomach growling is happening, which is for many people a really late sign of hunger. And so we forget, we lose sort of touch with those earlier stages or earlier signs of hunger, that, maybe being able to meet those needs then when the thought of food pops into your head, or recognizing, oh, I'm a little hangry. Maybe I've actually kind of gone past the point of needing to eat, can help us have more compassion for ourselves in those situations, rather than thinking of it as something pathological,
Yeah, great point. I just want to go back though to what you were saying about, what you were saying in self-help books, but I think it's really typical of weight management programs too.
Oh yeah.
Don't eat, go for a walk, don't eat, take a bath, whatever. And I think the problem there is that it's all about control. There's something I want, I'm not supposed to have it, so I'm being told to go do something else. So the way I often talk about it is, if you can identify, what am I really hungry for right now? I'm I'm hungry for connection, or I'm hungry for, whatever. It, so you might say, I'm hungry for stimulation and decide to go take a walk, but it's meeting a need. You know what I mean? It might look the same. It might look like the same walk, but it comes from recognizing the need first. And, I think it's really important that people label, what is it the food does for me? And people will say it numbs, it distracts, it calms. And so starting to ask that same question. So I'm reaching for food and I'm not hungry. And like you said, Christy, food is always an option. It's not a failure if you end up going to the food. At the same time, you might say, is there anything else that would calm me or soothe me right now? So it could look the same as what those weight management programs tell you to do, but you're not just controlling, you're actually connecting to yourself and making a decision about the best way to meet your needs in that moment.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. All right. Our next question, please.
Had people tell me I look like I've lost weight. How should I respond? So I've thought a lot about like how compliments can be so toxic, right, in this culture. And sometimes I think people, when they say something like, oh, you've lost weight, you look great, there's this compliment either sort of implied or explicitly attached to the end of it. And I think it's hard to know what to do with that when you feel like someone's trying to be nice to you, but you're like, oh, this is, triggering me, or this is not in line with my values or whatever, right? So I think, there's a newsletter I have coming out about this, if it hasn't come out already, about sort of ways to respond to compliments about weight loss. And sometimes it's just perceived weight loss too, right? The person thinks you look like you've lost weight and you actually haven't, or who knows. So I think sometimes it can be helpful just to say like, I haven't been intending to, or, this is not, weight loss is not something I'm aiming for, right? Or I'm, if you want to sort of get more deeply into it and it's someone you're closer with, well, I'm actually practicing this thing called intuitive or attuned eating and letting go of the diet mindset, letting go of efforts to lose weight. So I don't really know what's happened with my weight, but, I'm trying not to make that a value, right? Sometimes I think thanking the person for, trying to give you a compliment, right? Like I understand your intentions, are good in pointing this out, but actually to me, it's a little bit triggering or upsetting to have someone making comments about my body, right? To sort of recognize that someone's noticing and comparing my body to what it was before, like that's not super helpful to me. And I'm actually, again, if depending on how close you are with the person, you can say, I'm working on healing my relationship with food. I'm have had a history of disordered eating. And so talking about my body or making comments about my body is not super helpful for that process. Those are a couple of things that just come to mind right now. I don't know, Judith, if you have other ideas.
Yeah, it's just so complicated because, you're giving great explanations, and yet sometimes people just aren't comfortable giving such a full explanation. And yet at the same time, feeling like if they say thank you, and like you said, sometimes people haven't even lost weight. They're just maybe feeling better. And in this culture, people assume if you're feeling good, you must have lost weight, I think. But if they say thank you, then they feel like they're validating that it's better to lose weight. And so I've had clients just very simply say things to like, I don't keep track anymore, but I am feeling good, thank you, or something like that. Just a more simple. And I think just the flip side of that is, well, that we need to make sure that we're not complicit in giving compliments to people, because in this culture, it's just expected. And that can be difficult too, that if you do have a friend or colleague or whatever who loses weight, sometimes they want the compliment. Hey, have you noticed I've lost weight? And then we're in a bind because, we want to be kind, but we don't want to reinforce. And so, I've had people say things like, I see you're feeling good and I wish you all the best. Or, I cared about you before and I care about you now. Your weight isn't what's important to me, but I'm glad you're feeling good. So it's tricky out there, but I do think it's important to just visualize ways to respond in these situations.
Yeah, it can be helpful to practice ahead of time and have like your little go-tos in your back pocket. So
Exactly.
yeah.
I think what I understand is we have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
If you have thoughts about that, I'll just say, honestly, addiction is not my area of expertise. And so I don't have a lot of experience with that question.
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise either, but I will say from a nutrition perspective, I know that um, a lot of people think of, addiction as something that can, getting sober from addiction can cause weight gain. And that's sort of, I think, almost like lore in some of the 12-step programs, right? And there's Overeaters Anonymous, which is sort of designed to help people with what's considered these quote unquote transfer addictions. People might sometimes think, I got sober and then I started eating all this sugar or whatever. And I don't know if there's really a lot of evidence to say that that's true. I think that's like a clinical phenomenon that happens, but I think it's sort of a common thing that people talk about, and feeling like they're addicted to food after being addicted to another substance, because the research on food addiction is actually really problematic, and that's like a whole other conversation. But basically, the evidence really shows that you can't really be addicted to food in the same way as other substances, and so the idea that you're sort of transferring an addiction to food is not necessarily scientifically supported, even though it might feel like, people are turning to food more for comfort. And I think sometimes, eating disorders and substance use disorders definitely do coexist in a lot of cases. And so I think getting help for the eating disorder, sometimes I've seen in some clients, right, they'll have like the presenting sort of the initial thing that brought them into therapy or treatment is the substance use disorder. And then as they get sober, the eating disorder emerges, and then they start getting help for that, right? And so I think having, good support and people to refer to who treat eating disorders when you work with addiction, and who treat eating disorders not from a food addiction, quote unquote, model, but from a model of based in intuitive eating and health at every size, that is not going to pathologize people for any weight gain that might happen along the way of eating disorder recovery, I think is really important. I'm struck too by when you said, like, when they get sober, they experience a significant weight gain. And in some cases, I think, a lot of people who are drinking in particular, or taking, meth or other substances that sort of suppress the appetite, people can have a resurgence of appetite, right, with getting sober. Or in the case of alcohol, if they were drinking all of their energy, right, and not eating enough food because they were drinking all the time and not thinking about it, getting sober can sort of unmask that need for food, and weight gain can be a result, which is maybe a positive thing, in those situations where someone might have had malnutrition, right, before, or had some varying degrees of malnourishment. So I think it's complicated, and I think not pathologizing the increased appetite, the increased weight, or any sort of self-identified cravings for sugary foods, but instead sort of looking at how can we get this person support for disordered eating recovery, and how can we support them in just coming back into maybe a more regular eating pattern when, if they've been drinking all day or doing drugs all day and not really eating consistently, just sort of getting them back to nourishing themselves more consistently. So yeah.
I'm glad you could take that one. They indicated that there's one last question for us. I know we thought
okay.
But it sounds like there's one more coming.
Yes.
When I see my family at Thanksgiving, there'll be a lot of triggering conversations about weight. What should I do? Oh yeah, that's coming up in just less than a week here. This is a really common concern for people who start down this path, the anti-diet path, because it's a real shift, right, in framework, in beliefs and values. And so often, like with my clients, they engaged in diet talk at holidays in the past. That's just the norm. And so now they're realizing how harmful those conversations are, how triggering they are, and want to do something else. And so then it depends on what the families come in so many different ways, so many different dynamics. So there will be some families where, I'll have clients who actually sit down and say, hey, I want to share with you what I'm doing. And I want to tell you why these conversations, no longer serve me. And at least just try to set a boundary. Can we just agree during dinner, we'll enjoy our food and nobody will comment on calories and points or whatever else, or weight. And, some families are receptive to that. Other families aren't. And so sometimes, people use strategies like trying to change the conversation. Some weight loss comes up. Oh, you know what? Rather than talking about weight, I'd really rather tell you about this new relationship I'm in or this interesting course I'm taking, and just trying to change it. And sometimes people get to where they have to really leave the room, excuse themselves or quietly or but just find that the dynamics are not serving them in any way, and it's time to get up and use the bathroom or go text a friend for support or do something like that. So I hope that, Mo, to end on a positive note, I'll turn it over to you in a second, but I hope that people can, again, plan ahead. Sometimes people even have conversations before they go home, not waiting till the last minute. And, for yourself, hold on to, I know I'm doing, that self-compassion. I know I'm doing what's right for me. And I know my parents or my sister or my brother or whoever are caught in diet culture. And I've even had clients say, as they've gotten further with this, I just feel sad for people because here I am enjoying my food. I end up feeling good afterwards, and they're not able to enjoy it. And so hold on to your own journey and keep finding support, if not from your family, in other places.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think, the changing the subject, the sort of having gentle ways to set boundaries and redirect is all super, super important. And just acknowledging that people are on their own path too, right? One thing that I think sometimes can be helpful is if you do have someone going into that situation, maybe a close sibling or cousin or somebody who knows about your history with food, or who you can share about that with ahead of time, and who could be kind of an ally to you maybe in this process, so that at least, if diet talk does start to come up, either they can help in changing the subject, or at least you can kind of like elbow each other and roll your eyes and have that little bit of solidarity, I think, can be helpful. And then also, I think if you're going to be, saying anything about, having any sort of longer conversation, either ahead of time or with select people kind of in the moment at the gathering, I think it can be helpful to just keep it focused on like I statements, So in my experience, dieting has been really harmful, or I'm working to heal from disordered eating. And so I've found that it's, really helpful just not to have these kinds of conversations about weight, rather than getting into, debating people on the science, which I think sometimes, some of my clients who come in, I think because of the stuff that I write and speak about a lot, about the evidence for health at every size and intuitive eating and against diet culture, will be all fired up to try to have debates with people. And I often say it's kind of like, talking to people about their diet is almost like talking to people about politics or religion, right? It's very personal and deep and has so many culturally conditioned roots, right? And so I think, not getting into sort of the debates about it as much, but just keeping it focused on like, well, I feel, this has been what's worked for me, and I would appreciate it if, X, Y, and Z, I think is useful.
Yeah. All right. Well, Christy, this was great to do with you today, and I appreciate Patsy hosting us, and I hope people will enjoy our Making Peace with Food card deck.
Yeah, thank you all for being here, and thanks so much to Patsy for hosting, and this was great, Judith. Thanks for the chat.